Alright folks, it's time to play. What bad game will Patrick talk about today that almost everyone online has talked about already? And on today's special episode of WBG, WPTA, TTA, EOHTAA, we've got quite the selection. Let's give that wheel a spin, shall we? We have a winner. Looks like it's Bubsy 3D, ladies and gentlemen. Want to see how Patrick somehow squeezes more juice out of this one? Tune in right after the little intro title card thing to find out. Thanks for playing, everyone, and until we meet again on What Bad Game Will Patrick Talk About Today that almost everyone online...
The hills are alive with the sound of bobcats! Wow!
Grab your pepper spray, gang. Bubsy's in town. I'm under no delusion that I'm anywhere near the first to talk about this guy. It's almost a rite of passage at this point for any schmuck with a YouTube channel that happens to discuss video games to cover the misadventures of this loathed lynx, and I suppose now is my time. Today, I become a man. In the 90s, everyone and their nannies were cooking up what they'd hoped to be the next big mascot platformer. The blueprints were laid out. Have a quirky and energetic character that kids can enjoy within a fun world that's engaging to play in. Getting this formula just right could result in a beloved franchise that would potentially span decades. You'd be printing money with the sequels, cartoon spin-offs, memorable catchphrases. What could possibly go wrong? In 1993, it was time for the company Accolade to make their big play for the spotlight, resulting in the video game mascot equivalent of that one drunk guy at the party wearing a Hawaiian shirt and thinking putting a lampshade on his head is still a wild and crazy idea anytime after 1982. That would be one Bubsy Bobcat, who has gone on to be one of the most infamous figures in gaming. Not only does his track record range from uninspired to unplayable, but his personality and voice is believed to be one of the most gratingly annoying frequencies that a human ear can perceive.
What could possibly go wrong? Did I mention I don't like heights? More like a bridge too short. Hey, whatever blows your hair back. Hey, I thought I saw Elvis back there. Shouldn't that be my contract? Not me. I think
But hey, hate him or really hate him, one has to admit that Accolade placed all their bets on this thing. And despite the messy and poorly received nature of his first outing, Bubsy would technically go on to span decades, seeing a few sequels made and, yes, even getting his own cartoon series. Well, if you count having a failed pilot as having a series. I was going to give a brief summary of this episode, but honestly I don't think I could sum it up any better than the Bubsy Bobcat wiki itself, which says of the pilot, quote, "Viewer reaction wasn't good and the cartoon failed to entertain." Yeah, that certainly sounds like Bubsy. But just how did the Bobcat bridge the gap from simply being a forgettable mascot to being one of the most despised? Well, in my opinion, the biggest offense will always be 1996's Bubsy 3D. 96, man, what a time to be alive. I mean, I wasn't born yet, so all in all it was a little boring for me, but in the world of gaming, things were certainly changing. Revolutionary advancements in hardware were beginning to allow for widespread adoption of polygonal graphics and three-dimensional gameplay, and it was catching on like wildfire. If you were still in 2D at this point, you might as well throw yourself away with yesterday's tomatoes because we are all about this new axis, baby. And that means all the tentpole gaming franchises were taking their swing at how to best embark upon this new frontier. Growing pains were abound as many companies scrambled to figure out how to translate their once state-of-the-art gameplay to a completely different style in order to keep up with the trends and be what all the kids of the time were calling the bee's knees. Again, I wasn't alive yet, so I just assumed that was the modern slang back then. You better believe that our old friend Bubsy just had to take part in this new wave, and a little boy version of myself would be fooled by his beckoning mug on the cover into believing that this title would be one worth taking out of that bargain bin I found it in 2 decades ago. Point is, I've got some history with this menace. I never got anywhere near finishing it, and just by looking at it, I'm sure it's self-explanatory as to why. There was just so much else to play at the time that was providing me a much better experience. And so, unlike many of my other early outings in the medium, this title would remain uncompleted by me. But I gotta tell you, I hate to leave something unfinished. It evokes an unsatisfying feeling that there's a thing out there that I still need to do. Speaking in retrospect now, I would have rather that thing have been to make toast in the bathtub because, wowee, this was a mistake. However, I knew it was my long-awaited destiny to finally get to say I beat Bubsy 3D. So today, that's just what I'm going to do. There you go, see? I did find an angle after all. Before we start, who are the main culprits here? Well, the aforementioned game studio Accolade would publish the PlayStation 1 title, and Eidetic Incorporated, now known as Bend Studio, would be brought on as lead developer. Also taking part would be the original creator of Bubsy, the late Michael Berlin, playing a major role in the platformer's design. There's a lot to take in here, so let's do it piecemeal and start with the story. Or rather, everything I could glean from this opening cutscene. On the abstract and bizarre planet of Rayon, a meeting is being called by the inhabitants, the Woolies, in regards to a familiar threat. It seems the Woolly Queens of the planet made an attempt to abduct Bubsy Bobcat from Earth in order to prevent him from stopping their invasion attempts. Though Bubsy would eventually escape their capture, he was now stuck on the alien planet until he could find enough ship parts to get himself home. All while the Woolly military is gunning for him. And boy are they gunning for him. More on that later. Apparently the only thing the Woolies want from Earth is to steal all the yarn? Get it? 'Cause he's a cat? Settle in, people, there's a lot of that going around. But hey, I just might make that trade if it meant not being on the same planet as this thing.
I knew I should have taken that left turn at Uranus! Was it something I said? What could possibly go wrong?
That's Lonnie Manila providing the voice of Bubsy. She's quite a decorated figure in the world of video game voice acting, with a lot of memorable performances under her belt. Her talent speaks for itself, and I certainly don't blame her for how maddeningly annoying Bubsy sounds. It's clearly all in the direction, which must have been something akin to,
Hey, Lonnie, for these lines, can you just sound like the worst thing anyone's ever heard? We're gonna see how that goes.
credit where it's due. She certainly gave them what was asked of her. And there's plenty of lines all throughout the game, just in case you want more to appreciate.
Woohoo! Now, if you lose a Bubsy, you'll start over here instead of at the beginning of the level! Ain't life grand?
It brings to mind the main issue I have with Bubsy as a character, in that I don't know if I get what they're going for with him. Is he meant to be so annoying that he's hateable, and that we derive enjoyment from seeing him get zapped or pummeled or shatter like glass? Or is he meant to be our likable, plucky protagonist that we want to see succeed and do more of his dated Schwarzenegger impressions? These two choices are on complete opposite ends of the character spectrum, to where having an attempt at making them coexist within the same host leaves a main character that's just blech. Even as a kid, I didn't like this guy. Something about him just feels like a cheap bootleg, and that feeling is accentuated the moment control is placed in the player's hands. Tank controls. Why does it always have to be tank controls? Well, to be fair, I've been pleasantly surprised by other unseemly titles with this method of movement in the past, so it's not a death sentence off the bat. No, that would be reserved for the camera. Bubsy's jump is quite high and rather floaty, which makes landing on these hilariously generic platforms a tad easier. Though what doesn't make it easier is how the camera moves to a top-down position every time you jump, in what I can only guess was an attempt to help players see where they're going to land. It's a nice thought, but one that fails to consider how disorienting it is to have such sudden camera movements in a game that requires a lot of quick and precarious jumps. I'm not one to get motion sick, but my head was pounding after a few hours of this. It got to the point where I found myself constantly jumping just to keep the camera steady. And by late game, it was essential to move this way with how brutal these stage enemies can be. Good lord, I cannot tell you how many times I took damage from things that I couldn't even see coming. You have a few hits before losing a life and being sent back to a checkpoint. Unless, of course, something hits you while you're mid-jump over a hazard, in which case you go plummeting before you can even figure out what happened. Bubsy has two methods of taking enemies down. He can jump on their heads, which leads to varying results due to the pretty unforgiving hitboxes, or he can shoot one of these atoms that are scattered across stages by holding down the square button as he picks it up. I do kind of like the idea of the main collectible having multiple uses. It adds a level of replayability and versatility to the gameplay. Or perhaps it would in any other title, but I'm not playing this again. Though there are some things to consider when shooting these atoms, like needing to fire within, I think, like 3 seconds, or else the atom blows up in Bubsy's face and you take a hit. You also need to make sure you do hit any target you're aiming for, otherwise the atom will boomerang right back to Bubsy, causing damage if it collides with him. Come on, man, these are some pretty strict parameters. Do you want me to like this move or not? There's also some power-ups such as invincibility and invisibility, both of which operate exactly as they sound, and this one that gives you a stock of atoms you can fire from anywhere, without having to be standing next to one already. That would be Bubsy's arsenal on dry land. In the few obligatory underwater stages they have, Bubsy is equipped with this dash move, which is actually pretty helpful, until you realize just how quickly it depletes his air supply. It drops like a rock when you use this move, to the point where if you even tap the button anywhere below a certain air threshold, you will instantly lose a life. Despite this, I was always happy to encounter an underwater stage. There are still cheap, unavoidable shots from enemies you can't see all over the place, but if you keep an eye out for the arrows, you can just zip right to the end of the stage by swimming over all the obstacles. Back to the enemies themselves, there's a handful of different types you encounter, from the regular woolies to flying birds to transparent snakes. God, I hate these things. They're so fast and relentless. And most of the time I just end up walking right into them due to how hard they are to spot on these distracting backgrounds. Oh, is it time to talk about how the game looks yet? I know it has a built-in plot point of taking place on an alien world, so the visuals are meant to be bright and kooky, but just how much should that realistically be allowed to excuse? At any given point, you are surrounded by multicolored textureless polygons with only the occasional environmental detail. I got so sick of the checkerboard design that riddled this game and makes every stage feel like the exact same thing, which I know wasn't the intention, because if you squint your eyes, which you'll be doing a lot of while playing this, you can sometimes see what they were going for. This is meant to be a factory, this one's meant to be mountains. I mean, I can kinda see it, but I'm meeting them more than halfway on that. The only time I think the visuals clicked in any capacity would be these cutscenes that play whenever you beat a level, serving as mini visual gags or even sometimes explanations for how Bubsy gets to the next location. This is something I didn't mind. They feel like genuine attempts to inject some personality, though I have a feeling the average player never got to watch a vast majority of them. Honestly, I might just be giving these a pass since, in my mind, they're linked with the feeling of sweet relief after just beating a gauntlet of a stage, a type of Pavlovian conditioning I didn't expect to experience here. The perks of having a peanut brain. Speaking of the visuals, surprisingly, animation legend Chuck Jones, known for his work on many of the classic Warner Bros. Catalog, is cited as having a role in this game's development by overseeing some of its art direction, though would ultimately go uncredited. Something seems a bit fishy about this claim to me, and not only because of the vastly inflated and completely false quotes all over the game's box, but because I can't seem to dig up any further information about Jones's actual influence. We've got kind of a Michael Jackson doing music for Sonic 3 situation going on here. Was he involved? Maybe. To what extent? I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, at most, they probably just slid a few pictures of Bubsy across his desk, to which he replied, "I directed the Roadrunner cartoons. Get this shit out of my face." There's 18 levels total, including a few boss fights, with the main goal always being just to get to the end. Unless you're a completionist, in which case, 1, may God have mercy on your soul, and 2, you'll have to be looking out for 2 mini rockets to collect in each stage. There was not a chance in hell I was even going to bother with these by the second level. Do I even need to explain why? This game can be incredibly unforgiving, so by the time I spot the end goal, I'm making a beeline to it just to get out of there. You can find these big floating telescopes that point your camera in the direction of a rocket, but the idea of prolonging my playtime by hunting for these cryptically hidden bonuses just was not something I had any patience for. Hey, the video's called Finishing Bubsy 3D, not 100%ing Bubsy 3D. It's still a shock to me how they seem to fumble on every single aspect of what this game is doing. Even the music isn't spared. Again, I get it, they're going for a weird outer space vibe, but it feels more like I'm drunk waiting in line for the funhouse while some carny harasses me for cigarettes. There's no discernible melodies, just a looping series of noise that, when coupled with the visuals, make me go even more insane. And it doesn't help that I'm stuck listening to the same music for a while, as these stages seem to get more and more aimless as the game goes on. As much as Bubsy likes to drone on in his explanations for basic things like checkpoints, he sure goes quiet when I'm on my third lap around a stage, desperately trying to figure out where the game wants me to go, since all of these environments look the exact same. Things not being fully explained don't end there. It took until I came across these fans halting my progress that I accidentally discovered that Bubsy has a glide move mapped to the triangle button. It's the same as his regular jump, but at the peak, he hovers in the air by outstretching his arms and legs, a move pulled from his earlier titles. I don't think the game explained at any point that you can do this, but even if it did, in my defense, I was pretty much tuning out whenever Bubsy started speaking by the end of the first level. Wouldn't you? Even after learning of this glide move, I completely forgot it was a thing consistently until those rare moments when it's mandatory. And why map it to triangle instead of just holding down the jump button? Probably the worst implementation of the move has to be during the first boss fight where you're meant to glide over these residue spots left over from the boss's attacks. But how anyone was supposed to guess that that's what you need to do is beyond me. I ended up doing it by complete accident out of desperation, flying high enough to be able to land on the boss, to which the only indicator that I was actually doing damage was Bubsy's stupid one-liners. I ended up beating the following boss, this woolly mammoth thing, in the same fashion. I assumed you had to jump on its stomach after it flips over to deal damage, but after doing that about 10 times, it was starting to feel like I was missing something. Then I tried to get it to slip on the banana peels it kept dropping, but with the camera always locked behind Bubsy, it was impossible to see what was happening. Eventually, the game told me I won out of nowhere, and I didn't question it. I'm sure there was a method to this, but I don't care. And I certainly didn't care by the time I made it to the final boss, the Woolly Queens. This whole last stage is just agonizing to its core, and if you mess up, you have to do it all over again. Which includes these hallways of endless projectiles, beating this awkward mini-boss, trying to hit 4 switches in the proper order while these tiny woolies harass you mercilessly, and then there's the fight itself. The idea is you hit a switch in the middle of the platform that unlocks atoms you can use to shoot at the bosses and take them out. Seems simple, right? Well, perhaps, until you realize that the bosses are constantly shooting projectiles at you that can go through walls, so you're not able to stand still for even a second without getting hit. I was jumping like a madman with no way of seeing where I was going, but knowing all I had to do was hit that switch and somehow aim that atom at one of these two fast enough before it blows up on me, as well as time it correctly so that the second I let go, one of their shots doesn't hit me before I have a chance to get out of the way, because yeah, that happens a lot. This was intense for all the wrong reasons. If you blow it, it's back to the start of the stage, which means playing Bubsy 3D for longer, but you also have such a small success window that it genuinely feels like they did not want you to beat this game. It's one of those bosses where you just want to sit the people who designed it down, put the controller in their hands and say, okay, you do it. You show me exactly what you had in mind for how to beat this, I beg of you. But should the stars align and you do manage to beat both queens, you'll have done it. You'll have beaten Bubsy 3D, and what a feeling it is. As I said before, I didn't collect all of the bonus rocket ships, so I got what was considered to be the quote bad ending, which includes a cutscene that absolutely drags, just to tell you that while Bubsy did escape the planet, he didn't quite make it all the way home, so the Woolies can still continue their invasion. Well, kind of a bummer ending there for going through all the trouble, though this had me curious what the quote good ending would be. So much so that I was inspired to go back and collect each and every rocket ship in all of the stages in order to unlock... I'm sorry, I couldn't finish that without laughing. No, I just googled it like a stable-minded person. And wouldn't you know it, it's pretty much the same ending. Instead of not making it all the way back to Earth, Bubsy does make it back, only to discover he was sent back in time to the Jurassic era, and the Woolies continue their invasion. That's the ending you get for collecting all the rockets? I'm pretty sure the regular ending is a better outcome. At least then, Bubsy just has to get the rest of the way back to Earth, not defy the laws of time. But hey, I beat Bubsy 3D. I mean, there were a few other things, like this 2-player mode where one person controls Bubsy while the other has an aiming reticle and tries to stop him. While I do like the idea of seeing the Bobcat taken out CIA style, what kid is gonna invite a friend over to play this? What do you say, Timmy? Should we play another round of Mario Kart? Or take rat poison? Oh man, Bubsy, you played this one all wrong. There are so many out there who deem this as the absolute worst game of all time. Is that true? Well, it's hard to be sure. What I am sure of is that I'm not as mad at the game as I thought I would be now that I've seen it all. Oh, I had a miserable time, there's no doubt about it. But at a certain point, I stopped feeling angry and just started feeling sorry for it. If this had come out even 1 year later, I might have been singing a different tune. But this was 1996 and one of the very first of its kind. It doesn't reek of being slapped together by developers who didn't care. It feels more like the result of a lack of experience meeting an undefined vision. Particularly tragic are the stories one can dig up from the development cycle, such as the one about series creator Michael Berlin catching a glimpse of Super Mario 64 at the '96 Consumer Electronics Show, and realizing all too late that their game was not going to stack up to what Nintendo had been cooking.
That's one fine-looking barbecue pit. Why doesn't mine look like that?
It's not fully void of charm. They seemingly had fun playing around with some common tropes of the era, or making these goofy little animations, but any good idea like this is buried by an endless pile of dated controls, poor hit detection, broken design, and an unrelenting difficulty to the point where it feels like there's zero reason to ever revisit this. Though even if that is the case, part of me feels that maybe we are lucky that this game exists. Let me explain. You've got to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right? Now in the case of Bubsy, not a single egg made it into the pan, but I'm talking about the bigger picture. Without this loud-mouthed simpleton showing us what not to do, we may not have learned as quickly about what did work in future 3D releases. The development of control schemes, camera movements, and art styles that would become instrumental building blocks of some of the most cherished titles in history owe a lot to... well, Mario 64. But just maybe this old Bobcat was also good for something after all. And maybe it is still worth finding new ways to talk about him, even when it feels like so many others have already done so. Should the industry have stopped trying after seeing these two show us how well and how poorly it can be done? Of course not. We would never have gotten anything new that built off of it. So just because something might seem like it's been done already, you never know. Maybe someone might just take the idea and run with it, ending up with a product that might just mean something to somebody, and that could never have existed without those who came before. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you find an angle. Hey, thanks for tuning in, folks. I didn't think I'd be able to get any more water from that well, but you know what they say, anything can happen on WBG, WPTA, TTA, EOHTAA. Remember to grab yourself a t-shirt on redbubble.com.